In today's video, we're going to be talking about environmental racism and what it really means in the real world. Environmental racism refers to the systemic pattern in which melanated communities are disproportionately exposed to pollution, environmental hazards, and underinvestment due to historic segregation, discriminatory housing policies, and unequal political decision-making. These outcomes are shaped by long-standing decisions about where industry is placed, how infrastructure is maintained, and how quickly help is delivered during environmental disasters, leading to unequal protection and recovery for certain communities. Environmental racism refers to the systemic pattern in which melanated communities are disproportionately exposed to pollution, environmental hazards, and underinvestment due to historic segregation, discriminatory housing policies, and unequal political decision-making. These outcomes are shaped by long-standing decisions about where industry is placed, how infrastructure is maintained, and how quickly help is delivered during environmental disasters, leading to unequal protection and recovery for certain communities. Here are examples that show how this has affected melanated communities in the United States. One major example is in Flint, Michigan, where a majority melanated city was switched to a contaminated water source in 2014 as a cost-saving measure. The water was not properly treated, which caused lead from aging pipes to enter the drinking supply. Residents quickly noticed changes in water quality and reported health concerns, but officials initially dismissed their complaints. Over time, children were found to have been exposed to dangerous levels of lead, resulting in long-term developmental and neurological harm. The crisis became a widely recognized example of environmental injustice and government neglect. Another example is Cancer Alley, a heavily industrialized region along the Mississippi River where many predominantly melanated communities live near petrochemical plants and refineries. Residents have long reported unusually high rates of cancer, asthma, and respiratory illness linked to constant industrial pollution. Despite repeated concerns from community members and environmental studies showing elevated risk, industrial expansion has continued in the area, reflecting how economic priorities often outweigh community health. Here are historical examples such as Warren County, where in 1982 a toxic waste landfill was placed in a mostly melanated rural community despite strong opposition. Residents organized protests, arguing that their community was targeted because of race and lack of political influence. Although the landfill was eventually built, the protests became a key moment in the environmental justice movement, highlighting how hazardous waste sites are often concentrated in communities with less political power. Another example is Chicago, where melanated families have lived for decades surrounded by landfills, factories, and contaminated land. The housing development was built in an area already heavily burdened by industrial pollution, exposing residents to long-term environmental hazards. This has contributed to high rates of asthma and other chronic illnesses, especially among children, showing how housing inequality and environmental exposure are closely linked. Here are examples involving disaster response, especially New Orleans. When Hurricane Katrina struck in 2005, levee systems failed and catastrophic flooding devastated the city, hitting predominantly melanated, low-income neighborhoods the hardest. Thousands of residents were trapped in homes, rooftops, and shelters for days without food, clean water, or medical care, and over 1,800 people died in the disaster and its aftermath. Many survivors criticized the government response as slow, unequal, and disorganized, saying that wealthier areas received faster evacuation and relief. In addition, many residents believe the levees were deliberately allowed to fail, and this belief is tied to widespread distrust caused by long-term neglect and unequal protection. After the disaster, large-scale government buyouts and redevelopment programs led to many damaged homes being purchased and neighborhoods being reshaped, which made it difficult for many former residents to return or afford to rebuild. As a result, entire communities were displaced, and many families felt pushed out of the city they had lived in for generations, deepening feelings of loss and abandonment. Here are additional modern examples such as Detroit, where thousands of residents, many from melanated communities, had their water shut off due to unpaid bills. This raised concerns about unequal enforcement of essential services, especially since water is necessary for health and daily life. The crisis highlighted how infrastructure decisions can disproportionately burden already economically vulnerable neighborhoods. Another example is St. James Parish, where residents have opposed the construction of a large plastics plant in an already heavily polluted region. The community, largely melanated, argued that adding another industrial facility would worsen air quality and increase long-term health risks. The conflict reflects a broader pattern where additional environmental burdens are repeatedly placed on communities that are already overexposed to pollution. Overall, these examples show that environmental racism is not made up of isolated events, but is a broader system that determines who is protected from environmental harm and who is left most exposed.
Back and forth.